Okay, go ahead, Naira.
Uh, Hello, Johanna. Hello, Gulnaz. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here with all of you and to take part in these beautiful conversations on tafsir and transregional Islamic networks. Today, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Gulnaz Sibgatullina. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the School of Historical Studies at the University of Amsterdam. Her research interests lie in the intersection of several fields: post-colonial translation studies, sociology of religious language, and religious conversion. Currently, she's a member of the European Qur'an, Islamic scripture in European culture and religion synergy team that studies the ways in which the Islamic holy book is embedded in the intellectual, religious, and cultural history of medieval and early modern Europe. Within this huge and significant research, her personal project examines the politics of the Quran translation under the Russian Tsar, seeking to provide answers on who, why, and for whom translated the Quran in Imperial Russia, and how these translations have influenced the understanding of religion in general and of Islam in particular. Gulnaz holds an MA degree from Moscow State Linguistic University and a PhD degree from Leiden University. Last year, Brill published her PhD research on the languages of Islam and Christianity in post-Soviet Russia as a monograph. Um, Thank you, Gulnaz, for your readiness to talk to us today. And please, you can start your presentation.
Thank you very much, Naira. And indeed, I will immediately jump to the presentation. Works. Hello, everyone. It is indeed an honor to be able to present my research in the Freiburg Conversation series today. I would like to thank Professor Johanna Pink and Dr. Majid Danishkar for their kind invitation and Dr. Naira Sahakyan for her word of introduction. The paper I'm going to present today draws largely on the research that I have been working on at the University of Leiden and Amsterdam in the past 6 years. My research was made possible thanks to generous funding provided by the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research and currently by the European Research Council as part of the larger synergy project, the European Qur'an. To the ongoing conversation within the Freiburg Conversation series, I would like to contribute in 2 ways. First of all, I wish to focus on a rather technical side of tafsir and present some of the theoretical considerations from the field of sociolinguistics and translation studies that I believe may help us to understand tafsir in the broadest sense of the term, that is, being a process of interpretation. Since my background lies primarily in language studies rather than theology, I will touch upon some linguistic technicalities of understanding the scripture and Islamic system of belief, specifically in non-Arabophone Muslim communities, and discuss issues related to lexicography and semiotics of religious texts. In talking about the process of the Quran interpretation in non-Arabophone settings, it is valuable, I believe, to highlight the interplay of 3 major processes: vernacularization, translation, and change of the system of religious belief as a result of the first 2 processes. The 3 aspects will constitute the 3 main blocks of this presentation. Secondly, I hope to be able to contribute to the discussion by introducing a community and geographical area that has been largely disregarded in the previous talks. Myself, an ethnic Tatar, I've been researching the religious language of Muslim communities in the Volga-Urals region of present-day Russia, and would like to share some of the findings with you today. Thus, I will use the case of Russian Muslims and Volga Tatars in particular to elaborate on theoretical considerations. Let's start with the first process, commonly referred to as vernacularization of religion. In a general sense, vernacularization essentially blends religious universalism, if we assume that such exists, with specific vernacular languages. In the following, I wish to share a theoretical framework for a diachronic study of vernacularization processes. In discussing the changes of vernacular language use over time, the focus lies on the ideologies about specific languages and consequently the functions and roles that each language has in fulfilling the community's linguistic needs. Here I borrow the definition proposed by my colleague Rajeshwari Panharipande. In a multilingual and multi-religious regions, the choice of a language to express a religion is determined by the ideology about the function of the religious language and the relative power of the languages to carry out that function. The first stage is vernacularization proper. In many of the present-day Muslim communities, the vernacularization of religion began in the pre-modern and pre-literate periods, in which access to sacred texts was limited and religious efficacy was tied to a specific language. Vernacularization at this stage involves the rise of vernacular languages endowed with the symbolic ability to offer privileged access to the sacred. The complex relationship between Arabic as the language of Islam and local vernaculars in early Persian-speaking Muslim communities was recently explored in depth in Travis Sadeh's magistral and far-ranging study. Assuming that many present today are familiar with this work, I would briefly touch upon the early Quran interpretations in Turkic language-speaking communities of the 14th and 15th centuries. Here on the slide, you see the list of a few interlineal Quran translations produced in variants of Middle Turkic and an example of a manuscript with interlineal translations. The emergence of early vernacular interpretation of the Quran arises as part of a broader literary production. In Turkic vernacular accompanies the process of Islamization and Turkification of Central Asia. The communication of religious law and the scripture to non-Arabophone converts to Islam naturally followed an oral path of translation. Therefore, by and large, these early interlinear translations into Turkic demonstrate three distinctive features. First of all, these Turkic translations occur in the milieu of vernacularizing Islam, where often non-Arabic but Persian text functioned as a source. Vocabulary, syntactic structures suggest that the translations more often drew on the Persian translation, and the translators must have consulted the Arabic original only occasionally. Even in the bilingual Turkic Arabic editions, let alone trilingual Arabic Persian Turkic manuscripts, the Persian interpretation is lingering in the background. Secondly, the glosses that accompany the Arabic words were not supposed to exist without the original text. Alone, they didn't constitute a coherent, intelligible message. Based on this observation, the researchers suggested that these translators serve primarily as some sort of course material for ulama and Muslim political elites who were not yet fully proficient in Arabic. Instead of being literary translations, this manuscript functioned as a support for comprehension-based reading. Such copies of the Quran that assisted understanding of the revelation must have also been used as a tool for conditioning a religious mission in non-Arabic settings. Finally, these early translations are notable for their creative avoidance of Arabic loanwords for denoting Islam-specific notions, which are replaced by pre-Islamic religious terminology and/or neologisms. The next stage in the vernacularization process is what is called indigenization, which blends religious universalism with local particularism by adopting religious ritual, expression, and hierarchies into the specifics of a particular ethnicity. In other words, indigenization connects specific faith with the ethnic group, whereby religion, culture, and language are being fused into a single unit. Among speakers of Turkic after the 15th century, translations of the Quran into Turkic languages seem to increasingly acquire functions that go beyond the comprehension of single linguistic units. The rendering of the sacred text becomes supplemented with an extended range of available interpretations of the Quranic lexicon, or with possible understandings of ayahs and surahs. This practice has prepared the ground for the consequent growth of the genre of commented translation and later tafsir. In this period, also the rift between Eastern and Western regional standards of Middle Turkic widens exponentially, both in terms of linguistic characteristics and usage, eventually resulting in the formation of different languages and tafsir traditions. If we summarize this period, then we can again distinguish three distinct features. Thus, in the indigenization period, the translation ceased to function primarily as a point of access to Persian and Arabic text, because this was not necessary anymore. Instead, there was an increasing role of renderings performing cultural appropriation, that is, when texts were rewritten with an aim to fit into the new reality. The analysis of the pre-modern Turkic text yields such verbs as döndürmek, tasnifetmek, and talirizmek to refer to activities like interpretation and translation. Thus, the vernacularization has been related to three operations intrinsically intertwined with each other: interlingual translation proper, compilation, and changing. The third stage is nationalization. The principal difference between nationalization and the previous forms is that the nation began serving as the foundation for the religious institutions' claim to legitimacy. Nationalization operates through the use of religion as a potential source of nation formation or the intertwining of religious and national markers. Language, in this context, serves a double role as the marker of a distinct national identity and a medium for nationalizing religion. As the Turkic vernaculars began to play a dominant role in local manuscript cultures, Persian came to be seen as a barrier to knowledge and to popular literature consumption. The processes of vernacularization received a new boost in consequence of two important changes in the Muslim communities that came into full force largely in the 19th century: the introduction of printing and secularization of Islamic religious education. This transformation intensified each other's effects, eventually radically transforming the cultural and intellectual context of Muslim communities in the Volga-Ural region. As a result of these two processes, we see the emergence of new genres. Vernacular paraphrastic commentaries emerge as a result of non-ulama authors entering the realm of Quranic interpretation, most often as translators and compilers of classical tafsir work. However, neither in Ottoman Empire nor among Russia's Muslims, any of these vernacular translations rose to prominence above all others. However, simultaneously, vernacular languages became an object of study through the production of grammar books and consequently of governmental concern through their use in administrative bodies and propagation of native language education. In parallel, we see attempts to produce a word-for-word translations of the Qur'an into variants of Turki Tatar. These translations, however, didn't survive, thus not allowing us to conduct an analysis of them. The mentioned processes continued also after the 1917 revolutions and in the Soviet period, though obviously on a much smaller scale. In my recently published monograph, I focused on the fourth phase, that is, transnationalization of vernacular languages used in religious settings. The global construction of nation-states and nationalization of their citizens have necessarily created a category of so-called transnationals. In the context of migration, transnational people reconstitute their ties to both host and home countries, and they engage in a creative process of blending elements from both points of reference. While in the Soviet Union, the Muslim populations were largely assigned to their national administrative units, for example, the autonomous republics of Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, Dagestan, Chechnya, internal migration as well as the immigration of Muslims from other areas to Russia has led to a very new picture. Today, Tatars in Russia are almost everywhere in direct contact with Muslims from the Caucasus and Central Asia, and they all participate in the establishment of Islamic mosques and associations. Against this background, Russian is currently becoming the new major medium of all Islamic Russian discourse, and this leads to the development of a new Russian language of Islam. Thus, Russian, rather than Arabic or any of the Turkic languages, seems to be gradually becoming the language that all Muslims across the vast territories of the former Soviet Union have all in common today. At the same time, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, new strategies for controlling Russia's Muslim population were installed. And these strategies operate against the background of pronounced rapprochement between the Russian state and the Orthodox Church. The cases like present-day Russian, language that has only been recently co-opted for linguistic needs of Muslims, raises a pertinent question. What makes a language Islamic? Or, following case Versteeg, can a language be Islamic? From a sociolinguistic point of view, a religious language, also sometimes referred to as language of religion, has been defined as a functional variety, which can be distinguished from its non-religious counterparts by marked linguistic features at the lexical, syntactic, phonological, and stylistic level. The case of present-day Russia, however, where religious language operates also in secular contexts, seem to rather contradict this assumption that religious language is only the language spoken in the religious field. Moreover, when various speakers, often with competing agendas and different target audiences, use religious variants of Russian, it is problematic to apply terms such as religious sociolect or religiolect that suggests a cohesive group with distinguishable linguistic features. In the cases of Islamic Russian, the religious communities that use it are incredibly heterogeneous, from Islamic elites to various distinct ethnic groups to communities of converts. They all claim exclusive rights to this religious language and mark it as their identity symbol. Each speech community has its own arsenal of languages and registers, and the choices made are dependent on communication goals and audiences to be addressed. For instance, they may use the variants of Russian that are purified from, or to the contrary, overloaded with loanwords from Arabic. As Versteeg suggests in his paper, already with regard to pre-modern and modern contexts, the label Islamic language attached to the great cultural languages of the Islamic world seems to have been guided primarily by something else than linguistic considerations. The cases of European languages becoming new Muslim lingua francas seem to have even less linguistic ground to be distinguished from their non-Muslim variants, which further challenges the applicability of this label to a language. But let us move to the second point of my presentation, namely translation. Translation is obviously an important vehicle of vernacularization, and scholarly examination of intersection of translation and religion is neither extensive in translation studies nor in religious studies. As a result of the cultural turn in translation studies, which took place in the 1980s, theorists of translation now focus not solely on the source text nor on the target text, but instead look at how different discourses and semiotic practices in language are mediated through translation. Religions here takes again a center stage, since the discourse of religion has been mediated through or even generated by translation. Today I will touch upon only interlingual translation, or also called translation proper, understood as an interpretation of verbal signs by means of some other language. The focus thereby will be placed upon a specific aspect of translation, but probably one of the most puzzling ones: what to do with key religious terms. Should they be translated or transliterated? For the sake of discussion, let's adopt Ferdinand de Saussure's two-part model of the sign. The Swiss linguist defined a sign as being composed of a signifier, the form which sign takes. Today we will talk about indeed spoken and written words, and the signified, the concept it represents. By and large, in order to transfer or interpret one religious sign in another language, we have several available strategies. The first one is that signifier stays the same, that is, the word stays the same. Let's take as an example the word Qur'an. In languages that use the Arabic script as their medium, loanword from Arabics could be adopted without much change in spelling. However, as the case of Tatars presented today already have shown, these Muslims have been forced to abandon Arabic script for their vernacular languages and first use Latin and later Cyrillic. And here you see already spellings in Latin and Cyrillic in Tatar. And at the current stage, we already talked that in the post-Soviet period, they simply changed the language and switched to Russian. And here you see two possible spellings of the same word in Russian. The same is true, obviously, to multi-ethnic Muslim communities in Germany, the Netherlands, and Britain, where European languages acquire new functions and serve the linguistic needs of local Muslim communities. In such cases, the transfer of an Arabic word into target language requires modification. Yet many of words of Arabic origin now assimilated into Russian and other European languages and found in most dictionaries. For instance, words such as Qur'an, Islam, jihad, they're already known to a lot of people who are maybe even not Muslim themselves. So on the one hand, borrowing a religious term and planting it in another language enables, at least at first glance, the preservation of semantic fields associated with the word. However, on the other hand, there are also many critics of transliteration strategy who argue that the Arabic words are altered in the process of transliteration because of the absence of phonetic equivalence. Therefore, some Muslims, although they speak Russian, may introduce additional diacritics to represent this sound system, or attempt to pronounce the words in a more what they think Arabic way. Both strategies are obviously very marked. Another argument the critics provide is that in post-9/11 contexts, the transliterated form may give a sense of the exotic and of cultural difference, which risks to further marginalize Muslim communities in the West. Finally, the fact that these words retain phonetic features of the original doesn't mean that they carry the same force in English and Russian. Since planted in another discourse, they acquire new meanings for speakers not familiar with the Arabic language discourses. However, as we will see in the next section, some of these phonemic translations acquire the function of nodal points in the structure of an Islamic discourse. These knots of meaning help to stabilize the other elements around them, and I will explain it in the next slide. Such a concept no longer refers to any one thing because it's too large and operates in so many different discourses, and therefore becomes rather a master signifier that functions as a metonymy for the whole discursive universe. And here we switch to second strategy, and second option for a transfer of meaning across languages is obviously changing the signifier, so taking another word. Let's again look at the word Qur'an. Into Russian, it can be translated as holy book or священная книга, an expression that is arguably neutral. More often, however, we see attempts to translate key religious terms via equivalence in the target language. For instance, the word Quran in some cases is translated into Russian as testament or zavet. And if the signifier is different, what happens to the signified? Well, many people ask. And here we have again two possible answers to this question. The first argument is that the signified is the same, both in Arabic and in this case in Russian. And this is obviously very ecumenical approach that suggests that there is a closeness between Christianity and Islam. However, what I see in the text that I've analyzed, this theological closeness is barely discussed. The second argumentation is that the signified is evoked through the context. But how does it work? In her work, Rajeshwari Pandharipande points out that in such instances, the multiple meanings are not mixed but are contextually defined. Different sociolinguistic triggers help to structure a given discourse, as is in our case entirely Islamic, and so differentiate the meanings that may the word have in Russian language and instead give Islamic meanings. These triggers can be hidden in the context of the discourse, for instance, when a speech given in a mosque, in the neighboring lexicon, that is in the terminology accompanying a word that carries exclusive Islamic meanings, or in the inclusion from other religion-specific languages, for example, adding Arabic greetings formula, which all together have so-called radiation effect and help to separate multiple meanings. And here, just to give you an example, the word Allah is translated as Bog, taking the Russian word, and it appears in the context of Quran interpretation. Here it changes from being an Orthodox Christian term into a synonym of the word Allah. Here the master signifier mentioned earlier, Quran, comes into play. It doesn't really matter how exactly the nature of the Quran is understood by the speaker. The word itself helps to structure and stabilize the discourse as Islamic. Since the Russian is still in the process of development as a Muslim lingua franca, speakers are continuing to search for adequate translation equivalents. In some instances, however, they may rely unduly on the sociolinguistic triggers and overstretch the discursive boundaries of semantic fields. Such an example where the Arabic word Maulid, which refers to the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad, was translated into Russian as Рождество пророка, literally meaning Christmas of the Prophet. And as we know from the experience, it hasn't been accepted by Muslims as a good translation variant. There are also obviously hybrid variants when, for instance, an Arabic root is combined with vernacular morphology, but given the limits of the time, and since they do not occur that often, we will not discuss them here. And in the final block of my presentation, I would like to reflect a little, or rather share with you the open questions related to the effects of vernacularization and translation processes on the system of belief. And the question indeed that I was trying to pursue in my research is what happens to the system of Islamic belief when it's expressed in Russian, Russian being the language traditionally used by Orthodox Christians. And here, in defining what is Islam and what is Islamic, I draw on Shahab Ahmed's seminal work first published in 2015. I cannot hope to unpack every aspect of Ahmed's conceptualization here. The most salient point is, however, that Islam is the result of aggregate discourse and meaning production, and its very nature is fundamentally hermeneutic. Following this logic, we may argue that Islam that is expressed in the Russian language, even if it's most purified from Arabic influences, still product of a dynamic dialectical relationship between the individual believer, community, and tradition. Though the profession of religion itself is universal, it's constituent upon the same elements: the existence and unity of God, the authenticity of Muhammad's prophetic mission, the authority of the tangible artifact of that mission, the Qur'an, regardless all of them being conceived in radically different ways. However, the case of post-Russian Islam poses some questions. Namely, does this claim still hold when, first of all, Islam is expressed through a vocabulary shared with another language in the context of unequal power relations? At the nominal level, Russia's big faith organizations are already forced to cooperate and develop an interreligious dialogue, however shallow and declarative nature this dialogue in fact is, in order to sustain religious peace in the country. But more importantly, these religions are also coming closer to each other at much deeper and more fundamental levels. They are developing similar views on Russia's domestic and foreign politics, similar doctrinal lines of defense against the challenges of modernity, and both of them interpret and protect societal moral norms along the same conservative lines. We thus observe the convergence taking place between the two significant conventions. If two religions share the vocabulary, such phenomenon seems to affect not only the state-promoted religious institutions, but goes also further to the communities. Secondly, texts become sites for dynamic contestations by different agents for the right to define what is truly sacred. The way translated texts are represented by translators and at times by institutions that back them allows ideas of the sacred to circulate in new configurations and in new contexts. In the increasingly globalized world, we see diversification of Islamic authorities, and in some cases there is again the push for making Islam accessible for Muslims who do not speak Arabic. And here I give an example of a case in Russia that indeed took place in the 90s mostly. There was a group called Krachkovsky. Followers of this movement didn't consider it necessary to study the Arabic language because they insisted that if this is not, the language is not given to you from birth, then there is no point in studying it since it will not give an opportunity for a deep comprehension of the Quran. Instead, they used a Quran translation produced by a prominent Russian and Soviet Arabist, Ignacy Krachkovsky. Although the cases like this are marginal, we cannot help but think about a question how the system of belief changes when also rituals are performed in languages other than Arabic, thus going beyond just level of comprehension, but touching on the performative powers that are associated with the Arabic. For instance, if Shahada, pronounced in Russian, is authorized and recognized as a valid declaration of faith, how does a Russian-speaking Muslim become different from a Muslim who pronounces it in Arabic, if at all? And to conclude, I indeed would like to just summarize some points that require further conceptualization in the field of indeed sociology of religious language. First of all, we indeed need to think about methods for tracing diachronic changes in the system of belief. And here the leading question, when a Muslim community adopts a new language, what has changed and how to measure it? Secondly, we need to indeed to think about the understanding of the interplay between language, ideologies, and rituals. When major rituals such as marriage, divorce, and funeral ceremonies are being conducted in non-traditional languages, so not languages that have been traditionally used in Islamic rituals, because the community simply doesn't speak it anymore. How does such a change affect the religion? And diachronic and diagraphical changes also need to be thought about in the understanding of the act of translation. So for example, how, for instance, the act of translating the Quran is being understood in Muslim communities across time and space. Thank you very much for your attention and hope to discuss some of these points in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gulnaz, for this excellent talk. Before posing my questions, I would like to emphasize the importance of your work. First of all, our audience, all of us, see that to conduct this kind of research, one needs several languages because otherwise it's impossible. And secondly, I would like to highlight its importance in the field of Islamic studies. I've been thinking that just 2 years ago, when I was participating in BRICE conference, British Association of Islamic Studies, I noticed that my research also, which also related to the Muslims of Russia, was so marginal. So you could listen such big names like Mutanabi, Ibn Khaldun, Ibn al-Arabi, but they never mentioned Bigiev, Gayayev, or Fakhreddinov or others. So this kind of research brings new sources, new standpoints in the field of Islamic and Quranic studies. And here that it makes this, you make this great contribution to this field. Now, I have two questions I would like to voice, but I believe they are not just questions, but will somehow help us to push this discussion further. You talk, your talk and research are in the sphere of linguistics, and you describe this logical formation of the discourse. I would like you to think also about the theological part. If we go to that sphere where we have that huge debate over the forbiddance or permissibility of the translation of the Quran, where some insist that we have this revelation in very specific type of Arabic, and many believe it should not be translated or it should only be recited in Quranic Arabic. They use these ayahs from Quran like وَهَذَا لِسَانٌ عَرَبِيٌّ مُبِينٌ. So it's forbidden to translate. So if we take into consideration this discussion and put your linguistic research on the top of this theological polemic over the translation, will the overall logic of your research or your argument somehow change or not? And the second aspect I would like to mention is in the first part of your talk, you mentioned this chronological order: vernacularization proper, indigenization, and nationalization. And your main case is Volga-Ural Tatar case. So are there any anomalies from this order, from these three phases? And also, will this process, this sequence, work also with other cases? Let's say if we take other Russian Muslims like Kumiks, Dagestanis also from Russia, from Dagestan, from the North Caucasus. Will this process work here as well, given that Arabic held its strong position up to this first decade, Soviet decade? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naira, for your kind words and indeed very important questions that you're raising. Let's start indeed with the first one about the rather theological connection, or how the linguistic aspect that I've been discussing today can be linked to theological discussions in the field. And indeed, it's a tricky question, especially if we take into account the discussions happening in the field right now, because indeed, starting with the book I mentioned already in my presentation of Travis Zadeh about the Persian vernacular translations, there is a shift, I think, also in the scholarly understanding of how to think about translation and how should we approach activities connected to interpretation of the Quran into vernacular language. And this general assumption that indeed Islamic theology has been dominated with an idea that Quran is untranslatable and therefore most of the Muslims were trying to go around it and sort of avoid direct translation doesn't hold anymore. And what I do believe, and in this case I very much inspired and grateful for a conversation that we have with my group from the European Quran Project and from Johanna Pink's group at the Global Quran, because indeed we have been already reflecting about how to understand what translation means, because it's not anymore just the idea that is currently dominant in the West, where the form and the meaning are separated and can be indeed transferred across the languages. We do see more and more examples that in the Islamic world, it's not the case. And translation was in various points in time understood differently. And this is also something that still needs to be studied, because we have now only elements from several regions, but there is still no comprehensive study of, something, how the term develops across the time and how the term is used in different regions. And that I think will shed also a lot of important light on what was actually the translation and how Muslims approached it. And in this case, I do believe that translation studies and sociolinguistics can help at least give some tools to scholars who used to operate mostly from rather theological points of view to indeed understand and formulate and conceptualize those activities. Answering your second question about anomalies and whether the system for understanding vernacularization processes applicable to other regions, again, very diverse world and very diverse case studies that we're operating, and I'm happy to see here indeed colleagues from who are specialized in different regions. But even if we talk just about Russia's Muslim, there also the case is not that easy to apply indeed the framework that I proposed. And I think the closest example where it does work is Ottoman Turkish Muslims, indeed with whom Volga-Ural Muslims had long time connections, and there was a lot of cross-country influence, and who have been also indeed practicing vernacular religious activities for longer periods of time. But for example, indeed you yourself have been working on Muslims in the Caucasus, and we currently have also a cool team at the University of Amsterdam. And there, in conversations with them, I do realize that it wasn't being the case, because in my question, hey, do you have Quran translations into Kumyk, Avar, at least at the 19th, early 20th century, where most of the Muslim communities started acquiring, or at least made attempts to produce sort of word-for-word translation, or at least a full comprehensive tafsir in the local vernacular language. In the Caucasus, we do not have it. So therefore, in these cases, of course, we have to, again, look very much at the regions themselves and study the socio-political context where these texts were produced and circulated. But at the same time, I do believe that the framework that I suggested may help us to at least look at the stages that many Muslim communities go through, just because we live in a globalized world and there is indeed cross-country influence, and certain processes, even maybe not directly, but still affect Muslim communities living in totally different regions. And in these cases, I do believe that this, at least schematic way, can help us to draw the parallels and create a bit more comparative studies work.
Thank you. So now we are going to open the floor for Q&A session, right?
Yes, but first of all, we are going to end the recording.